For 5 years I carried the king's washing, and never once let him see my face. It is easier than you would think to be invisible in a palace. A palace is built on invisibility. It runs on the labor of 100 hands that no one is meant to notice. The girls who lay the fires before the Lord's wake, the women who carry the linens down the servants' stair, the quiet ones who move along the edges of every gilded room, with their eyes down and their caps pulled low, refilling the wine, sweeping the ash, becoming furniture, becoming weather. The great ones of the court would sooner describe the pattern of the carpet than the woman who beat it clean. I know. I have stood 3 feet from dukes who had dined at my father's table and been no more visible to them than the shadow of a curtain. So no one, in 5 years, ever suspected that the servant in the grey cloak carrying the royal linens down the west stair was the woman who had once stood in the throne room of Valmonte and refused, before the entire assembled court, to wear its crown. They called me rue, in the servants' hall. It is a herb, bitter and green, the kind you grow by the kitchen door and use for grief and for medicine. And it is also an old word for sorrow, for regret. And I had chosen it for both meanings, though I told the housekeeper only that it had been my grandmother's name. My real name I had not spoken aloud in 5 years. My real name had been stitched into a betrothal banner and read out from the steps of the cathedral and written at the top of a marriage contract that was never signed. And it belonged to a woman the whole kingdom believed had lost her nerve and run. The coward bride, they called her. In the ballads the minstrels made of it. The girl who was offered a crown and a king and fled into the night like a frightened deer. The ballads had it wrong, they usually do. But I had let the wrong version stand, because the true one was more dangerous than any lie, and because a coward is forgotten in a season, while a woman who knows a deadly secret is hunted for the rest of her life. I will tell you the true version, because I promised myself, when I began this, that I would tell it true. 5 years ago, I was Seraphine Aldair, daughter of the old and dwindling house of Aldair, and I was named the fated mate of Ridian Vor on the day he was crowned king of Valmonte. You must understand what that meant, in the Pack Kingdoms, to be named a king's fated mate. It is not a betrothal arranged by fathers over maps and dowries. It is older than that, and stranger, and it cannot be faked or forced or bought. When an alpha comes into his full power, and for a king, that is the moment the crown touches his head and the whole weight of his people settles onto him, the bond wakes in him, and it turns, unerring, toward the one person in all the world whose soul answers his. The old ones say it is the wolf in him choosing, past all politics and pride, the single mate that will make him whole. It happens perhaps once in a generation that a king finds his true mate at all. It had not happened in Valmonte in 90 years. It happened to Ridian Vor on his coronation day, in a cathedral packed with every great house of the realm, and the bond turned, in front of them all, toward me. I felt it the instant the crown touched his head. I was standing far back among the lesser houses, a girl of 19 in a borrowed gown, there only because my father's rank demanded it, expecting nothing, wanting nothing but to go home. And then the whole cathedral seemed to tilt, and a warmth I had no name for opened in my chest like a second heart beginning to beat, and I looked up, and the newly crowned king was already looking at me. Across a sea of the greatest lords in the kingdom, past princesses and heiresses, and the daughters of a dozen powerful houses who had come precisely hoping to be chosen, Ridian Vor's dark eyes found a nobody in a borrowed gown. And I watched recognition and wonder break across his face, and I knew, the way you know your own name, that the bond had turned to me. The whole court knew it in the same instant. That is the thing about a true mate bond. It cannot be hidden. It lit the air between us like a struck match, and a gasp went through the cathedral, and within the hour I had gone from a forgettable girl of a dwindling house to the most important woman in the kingdom, the fated queen, the once-in-90 years miracle, the mate of the new Alpha King. And 3 days later, I stood before him in the throne room, and I refused it. The crown, the bond, him. I looked into the face of the one person in all the world my soul had answered to, and I said, no, in front of the entire court, and I fled Valmonte that same night. The ballads say I ran because I was afraid of him. That is the lie I let stand. Here is the truth. I ran because I was afraid for him, and because 3 days after the coronation, an old woman had come to me in the dark. She had been my nurse when I was small, and she had the sight, the true sight, the rare and terrible kind that the Pack Kingdoms both revere and fear, and she had come to my chamber in the palace on the second night of my new glory, white-faced and shaking, and she had taken my hands and said, I have seen it, child. I have seen the thread of it. If you bond with the king, he dies. Not in a year, not in 10, within the turning of a single season. The bond that is meant to make him whole will be the blade that kills him, because there is one who cannot bear to see the Vor line made strong, one close to the throne, who has waited a lifetime for a weak and mateless king he could rule through. And a bonded king, with a true mate at his side, is a king that cannot be controlled. The moment you complete the bond, you sign his death. She had gripped my hands until they hurt. A mate bond, once made, cannot be unmade but by death, so they will not try to part you. They will simply kill him and make it look like fever or accident or the natural cruelty of the world. And you, bonded, will feel him die through the bond, and it will break your mind, and House Vor will fall, and the one who waited will take the throne over both your graves. I had asked her who was the one close to the throne, and she had said the thing that made it impossible, the thing that took every ordinary weapon out of my hands. I could not see the face, only the shape of the intent. Someone close, someone trusted, someone who would smile at the wedding. What do you do with that? A prophecy with no name, a murderer with no face. I could go to Ridian and tell him, but tell him what? That my old nurse had dreamed his death. He would bond with me anyway. I could see it in him already, the way the bond pulled at him, the way a mate bond overrides all reason. He would take me and the crown and dare the world to touch us, because that is what Alpha Kings do, and he would be dead by the first snow. Or I could refuse. I could break the thing before it completed. An unfinished bond does not kill. It only aches, both ways, for the rest of 2 lives. But ache is survivable, and death is not. If I refused the bond, if I left him mateless, then the one who waited had no reason to kill him. A mateless king was exactly the king they wanted. My refusal was the only thing in the world that could keep Ridian Vor alive. So I refused him. I stood in the throne room, and I looked at the one soul that answered mine, and I told the most important lie of my life. I do not want you. I do not want this. I am not the woman for a crown. And I watched it land on him like a mortal wound, and then I ran, and I let the whole kingdom call me a coward, because a coward is safe, and a prophet is not, and because if anyone ever learned the real reason I refused, the faceless one who waited would simply find another way, and Ridian would die anyway, and my sacrifice would be for nothing. That was 5 years ago. I meant to run far. I meant to cross the sea, to disappear into some other kingdom where the name Aldair meant nothing, and the ballad of the coward bride had never been sung. I had it all planned, and I got as far as the harbour, and I stood on the dock with my passage bought and the ship before me, and I could not board it, because of the bond. An unfinished mate bond is a cruel and patient thing. It does not kill you, as the finished bond can, but it does not let you go either. The farther I got from Ridian, the worse the ache became. Not a metaphor, not a poetry of longing, but a real and physical wrongness, a hollow burning under the breastbone that grew with every mile, until, on that dock, with the sea in front of me, and the whole safe anonymous world beyond it, I could not take one more step away from him. I have since learned that this is known, that the old texts speak of it, that a refused bond binds the refuser worst of all, that in choosing to save his life, I had chained myself to his vicinity for the rest of mine. I could not go far. I could never go far. The bond would not permit it. So I did the only thing left to me. If I could not leave him, I would guard him. I cut my hair, and I dyed it dark, and I took a servant's name and a servant's grey cloak, and I did the one thing no one would ever expect of the coward bride who fled a crown. I went back. I walked into the servants' hall of the royal palace of Valmonte, the very palace I had fled, and I asked for work, and the housekeeper, seeing only a quiet, capable girl with sorrow in her face, gave me a place among the laundry women, and I began the strangest vigil in the kingdom's history. For 5 years I have lived inside the palace where I refused to be queen. 3 floors and a whole world below the man I saved, by breaking both our hearts. I have carried his washing. I have laid the fires in rooms he had left an hour before. I have learned the palace the way only a servant learns it. Every passage, every shadow, every face, every rhythm of the great machine. And I have watched, always watched, for the faceless one my nurse foretold, the trusted someone close to the throne, who waited for the king to die. Because if I could not stop the prophecy by fleeing, then perhaps I could stop it by finding the assassin before the assassin moved. 5 years of watching, 5 years of the ache under my breastbone, which never once faded, which flared to something near unbearable on the rare days I glimpsed him across a courtyard or heard his voice carry down a stair. 5 years of loving a man from the length of a palace away, in a grey cloak, under a false name, so that he might live. And he had lived. That was the thing I held to, on the hard nights. 5 years, and no fever took him, no accident befell him, no blade found him in the dark. Perhaps my nurse had been wrong. Perhaps my refusal had truly turned the thread aside. Perhaps I had bought his life with my own, and the price was simply this: a servant's cloak, a false name, a bitter herb for a heart. And it was a price I would pay 1,000 times over, because he was alive, and that was all I had ever asked. I had made my peace with it. I had told myself I could carry it forever. And then, on a grey morning in the 5th year, everything changed, because I found, at last, the thing I had spent 5 years watching for, and because Ridian Vor, for the first time in 5 years, looked at the servant carrying his washing, and went very, very still. It began with the wine. I was not meant to be in the king's apartments that morning at all. I was a laundry woman. My territory was the west stair and the drying lofts, not the royal chambers. But the head chambermaid had taken a fever, and 2 others with her, and the housekeeper was short-handed and desperate, and so she pulled me aside in the grey dawn and said, "You've a steady hand and a closed mouth, Rue, which is more than I can say for half the fools down here. The king breakfasts alone this morning before the council. Take up the tray, lay it, pour the wine, and get out. And for the love of all that's holy, do not speak to him, and do not let him see your face. He's in a black mood these days, and he cannot abide being gawped at by the staff. Eyes down, in and out. Can you do that? Eyes down, in and out. Do not let him see your face." I had done nothing else for 5 years. "Yes," I said, "I can do that." But my hands, taking the tray, were not quite steady, and I did not know, yet, why. I carried the tray up the 3 floors I had spent 5 years never climbing, up out of the servants' world and into the gilded one, up toward the man I had saved and lost, and with every step, the ache under my breastbone grew, warmer and warmer, the way it did when I drew near him, until by the time I reached the door of his private breakfast room, it was a low, steady burn, almost sweet, the bond singing its old broken song. He is close. He is close. I breathed the way my father's old master-at-arms had once taught me. Anchor, floor, breath, next thing. And the next thing was to open the door, and lay the tray, and pour the wine, and get out, eyes down, before the one soul in the world that answered mine could look up and see the woman he believed had run away forever. I opened the door. He was at the window, his back to me, a big dark shape against the grey morning light, his long dark hair loose to his shoulders, and my heart turned over so hard I nearly dropped the tray. 5 years. 5 years, and I had never once been this close, never once been alone in a room with him, and the bond flared so bright and so sudden that I had to set the tray down at once or drop it. And that was when I saw the wine that was already on the table. A servant had come before me, the under-butler, I would learn later, a soft-spoken man named Alric, who had served the royal household for 30 years, trusted, invisible, exactly the sort of man no one ever looks at twice. He had come before me and left a cup already poured, the king's morning wine, sitting ready at his place. And I, who had spent 5 years in the servants' world, learning every rhythm of the palace, knew at a single glance that this was wrong, because the king's wine was never poured until the king sat, never left standing. It was a rule as old as the household, and because, bending to lay my own tray, I caught, rising from that waiting cup, the faintest wrong sweetness under the wine, a smell I knew, a smell my herb-wise nurse had taught me to know a lifetime ago, the smell of monkshood, of wolfsbane, the one poison in all the world that can kill even an alpha king. 5 years of watching, 5 years of a faceless prophecy and a bitter herb for a name, and here it was at last, on a grey morning, in a cup of wine, the death of Ridian Vor, poured and waiting, 3 steps from his hand. I did not think. I knocked the cup from the table. It shattered on the stone floor, wine spreading dark as blood, and the king spun from the window, and for the first time in 5 years, Ridian Vor looked directly at my face. And I watched the whole world stop in his eyes. He did not move. For a long moment he did not so much as breathe, and neither did I, and the shattered cup lay between us, with its poison soaking into the mortar, and the grey light poured in around him, and he looked at me, the way a man looks at a thing he has seen 1,000 times in dreams, and never once expected to see in daylight. His face, that hard, handsome, closed-off face that 5 years of ruling had carved into something like stone, broke, slowly, the way ice breaks, a crack, and then another, and then the whole cold surface of it giving way to something underneath, that was young, and raw, and unguarded, and disbelieving. Seraphine, he said. Not Rue, not girl, not you. My name, my real name, the name I had not heard spoken aloud in 5 years, the name I had buried in a betrothal banner, and a marriage contract, and 100 cruel ballads. My name in his mouth, low and cracked and certain, and the sound of it went through me like the poison had not, straight to the broken bond under my breastbone, which flared so hard and so bright at the sound that I made a small sound of my own, half a gasp, and put my hand against the table to keep my feet. No, I said. It was reflex. It was 5 years of reflex. It was the same word I had said to him in the throne room, the great lie of my life, and it came out of me now, as it had come out of me then, because saying no to Ridian Vor was the only thing that had ever kept him alive. No, you're mistaken. I'm Rue. I'm from the laundry. I'll fetch someone to clean this. I'm sorry, my lord. I'm so sorry.
Stop.
He said it quietly, but it was a king's voice, and it stopped me. He crossed the room. He crossed it slowly, the way you approach something that might bolt, and I stood there in my grey cloak with my dyed dark hair, and my head that would not stay bowed, and I let him come, because the bond would not let me run, and my legs would not have obeyed me if it had. He stopped an arm's length from me. This close, I could see what 5 years had done to him, the silver just starting at his temples, though he was not yet 30, the deep lines bracketing his mouth, the shadow under his eyes of a man who did not sleep. This close, I could feel the bond between us, not as an ache, but as a roar, a great silent roar filling the room, his half of it, and mine. The thing we had never completed, straining toward completion, so hard that the air seemed to shake with it. Say it again, he said. Say no again. Look at me and say it. I looked at him. I opened my mouth to tell the lie one more time, the lie I had built my whole ruined life around. I could not do it. 5 years I had held it. 5 years of grey cloaks and false names, and the ache under my breastbone. 5 years of guarding him from the length of a palace. 5 years of letting the kingdom call me a coward so that he might live. And it all held, all of it, right up until he said my name, in that cracked and disbelieving voice, and looked at me as though I were water and he had been thirsty for half a decade, and then it did not hold at all. My eyes filled, my throat closed, and the word no, which had never once failed me, would not come. There it is, he said, very softly, and something terrible and tender moved across his face. You never could lie to me. Not really. Even that day, even in the throne room, I knew. I have spent 5 years telling myself I imagined it, that a woman who meant it could not have said it the way you said it, with your whole heart breaking in your eyes. I knew, and I let you go, because you asked me to, and I have hated myself for it every day since. His hand came up. It stopped, hovering, near my face, not touching. Seraphine, where have you been? Here, I whispered. The truth, now, it was falling out of me, and I could not stop it. I've been here, the whole time, 3 floors down. I never left. He made a sound as though I had struck him. I couldn't leave, I said. The bond, I got as far as the harbour, and I couldn't go. It wouldn't let me, so I cut my hair, and I took a name, and I came back. I've been carrying your washing for 5 years, Rydian. I've been laying your fires. I was crying now, silently, the tears just running, and I did not wipe them. I've been watching, guarding. I refused you to keep you alive, and then I couldn't leave, so I stayed to keep you alive, and I told myself I could do it forever. Keep me alive, he repeated. His hand still hovered by my cheek. From what? Seraphine, from what? And there it was, the whole weight of it, 5 years of a secret I had never spoken to a living soul, and the shattered cup at our feet, with its wrong sweetness still rising, and I looked at the man I had destroyed both our lives to save, and I told him. There's a cup on your floor, I said, that would have killed you before the council met. He went still again. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked down at the wine spreading dark across the stone, at the shards of the cup, and I watched him understand. Not all of it, not yet, but the shape of it, the fact of it, that the woman he had mourned for 5 years had appeared out of nowhere and struck a cup from his hand, and that the cup had been meant to kill him. Monkshood, I said. Wolfsbane. I know the smell. My nurse taught me herbs when I was small. It was already poured when I came in, poured and left standing, which is against every rule of your own household. The king's wine is never poured until the king sits. And it was waiting for you, 3 steps from your hand, on a morning your chambermaids all happened to fall ill at once. My voice was shaking. It's begun, Rydian. The thing I fled to stop. It's begun. He looked back at me. Tell me, he said. Everything. From the beginning. From the throne room. He glanced at the door, and something in him shifted. The raw, open thing, folding back into the king. But not here. Not where the walls are this thin, and a man just tried to murder me over breakfast. He reached out at last, and closed his hand, very gently, around my wrist. Not the grip of a captor, just contact, just the need to be sure I was real. And at the touch, the bond sang so loud I nearly wept from it, and I saw from his face that he felt it too, and the completion straining toward us, the 5-year ache of the refused bond, flaring at a single point of skin. Come with me. Rydian, I'm not letting you out of my sight, he said. Not again. Not after 5 years. If someone in this palace wants me dead, then the safest place for me is beside the one person in the world I know did not do it, and the safest place for you, Seraphine Aldair, is beside the king. You've guarded me for 5 years. Let me return the favour for the length of one morning. A ghost of something crossed his face that might, in another life, have been a smile. You can put your head down and play the servant if you like, but you're coming with me. So I went with him. He did not take me to the council. He took me instead by a way I did not know, even after 5 years of learning the palace. A narrow door behind a tapestry in his breakfast room, a stair inside the wall, cold and unlit, that let out into a small round chamber high in one of the old towers, a room with one window and a single chair and a great many books, a room that plainly no one entered but him. My grandfather's, he said when I looked around it. He hid here from his own court. I understand him better every year. He shut the door. He turned to me. And with the door shut, and the two of us alone in that small high room, with the bond roaring between us, some of the king went out of him again, and the man came back, and he looked at me with all 5 years in his face. Now, he said, tell me. And I told him, all of it. I sat in his grandfather's chair because my legs would not hold me, and he crouched down in front of me like a boy, so that his face was below mine, looking up, listening. And I told him about the coronation, and the bond turning to me across the cathedral, which he remembered. Of course he remembered. He had lived inside that memory for 5 years, the same as I had. And then I told him the part he did not know, the nurse, the sight, the prophecy that came to me in the dark on the second night of my glory, that if I completed the bond, he would die within a single turning of the season, killed not by the bond, but by someone who could not endure a strong and bonded king, someone close to the throne, someone trusted, someone who had waited a lifetime for a weak and mateless king he could rule through. That a mate bond, once made, cannot be unmade but by death, so they would not try to part us. They would simply kill him and make it look like fever or accident, and I, bonded, would feel him die through the bond, and it would break my mind that my nurse could not see the face, only the shape of the intent, someone who would smile at the wedding. So I refused you, I said, that's why. Not because I didn't. Ridian. Gods. Not because I didn't want you. I refused you because a mateless king was the king they wanted, and a mateless king they had no reason to kill. My refusal was the only thing in the world that could keep you alive. I broke both our hearts on purpose, in front of the whole court, because a live king with a broken heart was better than a dead one. I was crying again. And then I ran, and the bond wouldn't let me go far, and I couldn't bear to be far, and I couldn't bear to just abandon you to it, to whoever it was. So I came back. To watch, to find them before they moved. 5 years I've watched, and this morning, at last I found it, the cup, which means my nurse was right, and it was never over, and someone in this palace has been waiting 5 years for their chance. For a long time he said nothing. He had gone very still, crouched there in front of me, and his face had passed through disbelief and grief, and something like awe, and come to rest, at last, on a cold and terrible fury that was not directed at me. 5 years, he said at last. You gave up 5 years. Your name, your life. You let them sing that you were a coward. You carried my washing. He said it as though each fact were a stone he was setting down. To keep me alive. Yes. And I let you go. He closed his eyes. I stood there, and I let you say no, and I let you walk out into the night, because I was too proud to chase a woman who told me she didn't want me. And the whole time you were... His voice broke. He opened his eyes. The whole time you were saving my life, and I called it cowardice in my own heart, because it was easier than admitting I'd lost you. You couldn't have known. I should have known. He took my hands, both of them, in both of his, and the bond flared, and neither of us pulled away. I knew you couldn't lie to me. I said so not 10 minutes ago. I knew, and I chose the story that hurt less. His thumbs moved over my knuckles, over the calluses 5 years of laundry had put there, and I watched him feel them and understand them. No more. Do you hear me? No more choosing the easy story. You are going to tell me the whole truth from now until the day we die, and I am going to listen. And between the two of us we are going to find the smiling one, and I am going to take his head. He looked up at me. And then, Seraphine Aldair, if you will still have a king who was fool enough to let you walk away, We are going to finish what the bond began. Not because a prophecy allows it, because we've earned it, because I have wanted nothing else for 5 years. I could not speak. I only held his hands. But first, he said, and the king came back into his voice, cold and clear. We catch him. Tell me about the wine. Everything. Who poured it? So we began. The under-butler's name was Ulrich, and I had thought about him on the stair coming up, thought about it the way you turn a stone over and find something pale and terrible underneath. Ulrich had served the royal household for 30 years. He had poured the wine and left it standing. But Ulrich, I said slowly, working it out aloud, was not the smiling one. My nurse had been clear. Someone close to the throne, someone trusted, someone who would smile at the wedding. An under-butler was not close to the throne. An under-butler was a hand. Someone had used that hand, someone with the standing, to make an under-butler risk his life to murder a king. Someone Ulrich feared, or served more than he feared the axe. Find who Ulrich answered to, and we found the smile. Then we don't touch Ulrich, Ridian said at once. Not yet. If we take the hand, the head goes into the dark, and we never find it. We watch Ulrich. We let him think it worked. No. We let him think the cup was simply spilled by a clumsy laundry girl who's already been beaten for it and dismissed. He tells his master, the king lives, the girl is gone, no one suspects poison. And the master, thinking himself unseen, tries again. And this time, we're waiting. He looked at me. But it means you can't be seen, not by anyone. If Ulrich's master learns that the coward bride has come back to the palace, learns that Seraphine Aldair struck that cup from my hand, he'll know. He'll know exactly why you refused me 5 years ago, because it's the only reason that makes sense of your coming back. And then he'll simply kill you first, and me at his leisure. His hand tightened on mine. You've been invisible for 5 years. I need you invisible a little longer. Can you bear it? I've borne worse, I said. I've borne being invisible to you. Something moved in his face. Never again, he said. When this is done, never again. But for now. He rose and drew me up with him, and for one moment we stood very close in that small high room, with the bond singing, close enough that I could have leaned forward the smallest distance and ended 5 years. Neither of us moved. It was not time. We both knew it was not time. But he lifted my hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, to the calluses, slow and deliberate, and the touch went through me like fire, and when he straightened, his eyes had gone dark. For now, he said, a little unsteadily, you go back down, grey cloak, head down, and tonight, when the palace sleeps, you come back up the grandfather's stair, and we hunt. I went back down. I put my head down, and I played the beaten laundry girl, and I let the housekeeper scold me raw for breaking a cup in the king's own room. I told you, in and out, do not touch anything, and you go and shatter a cup, you great fool. And I took the scolding gladly, because it was exactly the story we needed. The clumsy girl. Nothing more, nothing to notice. And all the while my heart was up 3 floors in a small high room, and the ache under my breastbone had changed. For the first time in 5 years, it still ached, but it ached now like a wound that has finally been cleaned. It ached like something healing. That night, I climbed the grandfather's stair, and we hunted. We were careful. Gods, we were careful. 5 years had made me patient, and 5 years of ruling had made him shrewd, and neither of us would risk a misstep now, not with both our lives in the balance, and the smiling one still faceless. By day, I was Rue, invisible in my grey cloak, and I used that invisibility as I never had before, not to hide, now, but to watch Ulrich. A laundrywoman can go anywhere. A laundrywoman carrying a basket is furniture, is weather, is nothing. I carried my basket past the butler's pantry, and I watched who Ulrich spoke to, and who he flinched from. I carried it along the gallery, where the great ones walked, and I listened. And by night I climbed to the high room and told Ridian what I had seen, and he laid it against what he knew of his own court. the 1,000 things a king knows about the people around him, and slowly, night by night, we began to draw the shape of it. It took 11 days. They were not 11 easy days. Twice in that time, I came near to being caught, and either time would have ended everything, not only the plot, but us, and Rydian's life with it. Because a laundry woman seen too often near the king's business is a laundry woman someone begins to ask about, and Ambrose Deverain had eyes in every corridor. The first time was on the 4th day. I had followed a hunch down to the wine cellars, the deep, cool vaults under the palace where the household kept the casks, because I had reasoned that a man who poisons wine must have access to wine, and I wanted to see who came and went. I had my basket, and my grey cloak, and my invisibility, and I thought myself safe, and I was crouched in the shadow between 2 great casks, watching the cellar door, when a voice spoke directly above me, close enough to touch, and my heart nearly stopped in my chest. "You're a long way from the drying lofts, Rue." It was the steward, not Alric, but the head steward, a sharp-eyed man named Corvin, who missed very little, and who had no reason in the world to find a laundry woman crouched among the wine casks in the dark. I did the only thing I could do. I did not run, because running is what the guilty do, and 5 years below stairs had taught me that the invisible survive by being dull. I stood up slowly, with my hand pressed to my chest, as though he had frightened me, which he had, and I bobbed my head, and I made myself small and flustered and stupid. "Beg pardon, sir. The housekeeper sent me for a cask of the vinegar wine, sir, for the linens, the stubborn stains. We soak them in the sour wine, and I couldn't find it, sir. I've been that long looking. She'll have my hide." I let my voice wobble. Would you know where they keep the vinegar wine, sir?" And Corvin, who had been looking at me with sharp suspicion, looked instead now at a red-faced, flustered laundry woman babbling about vinegar and stains, and the suspicion went out of his face and was replaced by the mild contempt that the great machine of the palace reserves for its lowest hands, and he pointed me to a corner and told me to be quick about it and not to let him find me wandering again. I took a cask of the sourest wine I could find, and I fled with it, and I soaked linens in vinegar wine for 3 days afterward, so that the story would hold if he ever checked, and it held. But I had felt, for one moment in that cellar, how thin the thread was that we walked on, and it sobered me. The second time was worse, because the second time it was Ambrose himself. It was the 8th day, the day I followed Alric to the Chancellor's door, though I did not yet know whose door it was. I had trailed the under-butler along the upper gallery at a careful distance, basket on my hip, and I had seen him go in, and I had lingered too long. I should have moved on the moment the door closed, but I wanted to see him come out, to read his face, and so I dawdled at a window, as though wiping the sill, and I was still there when the door opened again, and it was not Alric who came out first, but the Chancellor himself, and he saw me. He saw me. Ambrose Deverain, the faceless one my nurse had foretold, looked directly at the woman he had spent 5 years watching for, and did not know her, because I was a grey cloak and a bowed head and a rag in my hand, because 5 years of being no one had made me truly no one, even to the man whose whole plot turned on finding me. He looked at me the way the great ones always looked at me, which is to say he looked through me, at the window I was cleaning, and he said, in his gentle grey voice, "Mind you get the corners, girl. The light shows every streak," and he passed on down the gallery with Alric white-faced behind him, and I stood there with my rag and my hammering heart, and understood that I had just been 3 feet from the man who wanted my king dead, and that my invisibility, the thing I had cursed for 5 years, was the very thing keeping us both alive. I finished the window, I got the corners, and then I went and was sick in a servant's passage, quietly, and climbed the grandfather's stair that night shaking, and Rydian held me until it stopped, and neither of us said aloud how close it had been. 11 days, and in those 11 days something happened that neither of us had planned for, and neither of us could stop, which was that the small high room stopped being only a war room. We were together, Alone. Every night. For hours. With the bond singing between us, and 5 years of grief and longing pressing at both our backs. And we talked. Not only of the plot, of everything, of the 5 years apart, what he had done, the wars he had ended, the treaties he had signed, the nights he had sat in that very chair and thought of me and called himself a fool, of my 5 years below stairs, the strange sisterhood of the laundry women, the small mercies, the way I had learned to read the whole palace like a book. He told me things he had never told anyone, he said, because there had never been anyone he trusted enough. And I understood then, part of what the smiling one had stolen from him. Not just a mate, but the one person an alpha king can be weak in front of, the one person he does not have to be a king for. I had taken that from him myself, when I refused him. I had done it to save his life, but I saw now what it had cost, and I grieved it with him. There was one night in particular, the 7th, I think, the night before I followed Alric to the Chancellor's door, that I hold apart from the others, because it was the night I stopped grieving the 5 years, and began, instead, to be glad of the ones ahead. We had finished the work early. We had drawn the shape of the household on a sheet of paper, every servant with access to the king's wine, every corridor, every rhythm, and we had run out of things to plan before we had run out of night. And so we simply sat, he on the floor with his back against the grandfather's chair, I in the chair above him, the single candle burning low, and we talked of nothing, of everything, of the small, ordinary things two people trade when they are learning each other, the things a courtship is made of, the things we had been robbed of. He asked me what I had missed most, in 5 years of being no one. I had to think, not the fine gowns. I had never cared for them. Not the rank, my name, I said at last. I missed my own name. No one had said it in 5 years. I had almost forgotten the sound of it. And he said my name then, softly, into the candlelight, Seraphine, just to give it back to me, and I had to look away because my eyes had filled. Then I asked him the same, what he had missed most. And this hard-closed king who ruled a realm was quiet for a long while, and then he said, not looking at me, being known. There's no one. When you're king, everyone wants something, or fears something, or performs something. Even the ones who love you love the crown a little more than the man, because the crown is what they can see. I used to think, before the coronation, that a mate would be, that there would be one person, at least, who saw me, and not the king. He turned his head and looked up at me from the floor, and the candlelight was in his eyes. And then the bond turned to you. And for 3 days I had it. That feeling, that here at last was the one soul that would know me. And then you were gone, and I decided I'd imagined it, because it was the only way to bear the loss. 5 years I've been the most known man in the kingdom, and the loneliest. He reached up, not quite touching my hand where it lay on the arm of the chair. You're the only one who ever saw me, even in the grey cloak, especially in the grey cloak. You've been watching me for 5 years, Seraphine. You know me better than anyone alive. Do you understand what that is? To a man who's never been known. It's the thing I refused to let myself want, because I thought it was gone forever. I came down off the chair. I could not help it. I came down and sat on the floor beside him, close, our shoulders nearly touching, and I told him the thing I had never told anyone, not even myself, in 5 years of the grey cloak, that guarding him had not been a penance, that I had told the housekeeper I took the name Rue for grief, and that was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that watching over him had been the great secret joy of my ruined life, that the glimpses of him across a courtyard, the sound of his voice down a stair, the ache under my breastbone that flared when he was near, had not only hurt, they had also been the only thing that made the years bearable, because they meant he was alive, and near, and mine to guard, even if he could never be mine to have. I chose to stay, I said. The bond kept me from leaving, yes, but I could have gone to another town, kept my distance, endured the ache from a mile off instead of 3 floors. I didn't. I came into this palace. I carried your washing on purpose, Rydian, because folding your linens was the closest thing to a life with you that I was ever going to be allowed, and I would rather have had that much of you than all of any other man. I had never said it aloud. Saying it broke something open in me that had been closed for 5 years. So don't grieve too hard over the lost time. Some of it, a great deal of it, I spent loving you. I just did it in grey. He did not answer with words. He turned, there on the floor of his grandfather's tower, and he took my face in both his hands, and he looked at me for a long moment as though memorizing it, and then he leaned his forehead against mine, and simply breathed, and I breathed, and the bond hummed between us, low and warm and patient, and we stayed like that until the candle guttered, 2 people who had found, in the middle of a war, in a small high room, the one thing each of them had spent 5 years believing was gone. We did not finish the bond that night either, but it was that night, I think, that we truly began. And every night, when it was time for me to go back down, we stood close, and neither of us closed the distance, because the bond unfinished is a held breath, and we had both agreed, without ever quite saying it, that we would not finish it in the middle of a war. It would wait. It had waited 5 years. It could wait until the smiling one was dead, and there was no shadow left to fall across it. But gods, it was hard. It was the sweetest and the hardest thing I have ever done, to stand a hand's breadth from Ridian Vor, every night with the bond roaring to be finished, and to turn, each night, and go back down the cold stair to my grey cloak and my narrow bed. He felt it too. I know he did. I saw what it cost him, and I loved him the more, for the fact that he never once pushed, never once used his rank or the bond, or my own aching heart against me. He only waited, with me, on the far side of the war, for the life we had both been promised and both been robbed of. On the 11th night, we found the smile. It was the wine that gave it away in the end, not the poisoned cup, but where the poison had come from. I had spent 11 days watching Alric, and Alric, I had come to understand, was not a wicked man. He was a frightened one, 30 years in the household, a wife dead, a daughter married south with children of her own, and a man with a daughter and grandchildren is a man who can be made to do anything, if you find the right grip on his fear. On the 10th day I followed him, at a distance, in my grey cloak with my basket, and I saw him go where an under-butler had no reason to go, to the private apartments of the Lord Chancellor, Ambrose Deverane, and come out again, white and shaking. And I knew, the way you know the last piece of a thing, that I had found the hand's master. I did not know the name when I climbed the stair that night. I knew only the door, but when I described it to Ridian, the corridor, the carved lintel, the 2 guards in green, he went very still, and then he laughed, once, without any humour in it at all, a sound like a blade drawn. "Deverane," he said. Of course it's Ambrose." He sat down slowly in his grandfather's chair. He was my father's chancellor. He held the regency for the 8 months between my father's death and my coming of age. He ran the whole kingdom, Seraphine, for 8 months. And he was good at it, and he loved it. And then a boy of 19 came of age, and took it all back. And Ambrose Deverane put on a smile, and handed me the keys, and told me how proud my father would have been. His hands had curled into fists on the arms of the chair. He has smiled at me across the council table for 6 years. He drafted my treaties. He stood at my coronation. He would have stood at my wedding. He looked up at me. Someone close to the throne. Someone trusted. Someone who would smile at the wedding. Your nurse saw true. It was Ambrose from the first. A mateless king is a king who might die without an heir, a king whose regency might come again, and a bonded king with a true mate and a line of strong sons is a king Ambrose Deverane will never rule through, not in this life. He couldn't bear it, so he decided, 5 years ago, that if you ever came near enough to complete the bond, I would die of it, and he would have his regency back over our graves. The fury in him was cold now, and absolute, and it frightened me a little, even though it was not for me. And when you refused me, he thought he'd won without lifting a finger. A mateless king, exactly as he liked. He put the knife away, and now, 5 years on, I've begun to talk of marrying, of getting an heir, even without a mate, because a king must. And a king with an heir is a king Ambrose can never be regent for again. He nodded slowly. That's why now. That's why the cup. This week, after 5 quiet years, I forced his hand by daring to think of a future. He'd rather kill me than let the Vor line go on without him at its head. Then we have him, I said. No. He shook his head. We have a shape, we have your word, and an under-butler's fear, and a door you saw him go through. We have nothing that would let me put the Lord Chancellor's head on a pike, without the whole court crying that the king has run mad and murdered his father's most loyal servant, on the word of a laundry girl. Ambrose is careful. Ambrose is beloved. Ambrose has spent 30 years making himself indispensable and irreproachable, and if I move against him without proof, half the great houses will rise, and he will have exactly the chaos a regent needs. He stood. He began to pace the small room. We need him to say it. We need him to condemn himself in front of witnesses who cannot be doubted, the great houses, the ones he spent 30 years courting. We need Ambrose Deverane to stand up in front of the whole court and show them his own face. He stopped. He turned to me, and a slow, terrible, brilliant light had come into his eyes. And I know how to make him do it. How? We give him what he wants, Ridian said. We give him a wedding. I did not understand at first, and then I did, and my blood went cold. You announce a marriage, I said slowly. Not to me, to someone else, someone safe, a mateless political match, an heir, the very thing that's forced his hand. And Ambrose, seeing his last chance slipping away, seeing a wedding that will get you a son and end his hope of a regency forever. Acts before the wedding, Ridian finished. He has to. Once there's an heir, he's finished. So he moves, in the open, at the ceremony itself, where all the great houses are gathered, because that's where a king is, that's where the cup is passed, and the crowd is thick, and 100 things can be made to look like accident. He'll try to kill me at my own wedding, Seraphine, in front of everyone. His jaw set, and we'll be ready. We let him reach for the knife in front of the whole assembled realm, and then we take his hand, and we make him say why, and the great houses see with their own eyes that the beloved Chancellor is a murderer of kings. No rebellion, no doubt, just Ambrose, condemned out of his own mouth, in front of everyone whose loyalty he needs. He looked at me, and some of the hardness went out of him. It's dangerous. If we misjudge the moment, I die for real. I won't pretend otherwise. But it's the only way to end it clean, to end it so completely that no shadow of it ever falls on our life after. And I would rather risk one dangerous morning than spend the next 50 years the way you've spent the last 5, waiting for a knife that never stops coming. Who? I said. My voice was not steady. Who do you marry? In this trap? And he looked at me for a long moment, and the terrible light in his eyes softened into something that undid me completely. No one, he said. That's the whole beauty of it. I announce a bride. I never name her. I let the court assume it's some safe political match to be revealed at the ceremony. And when Ambrose reaches for the knife, and we take him, and it's finished, I turn to the whole assembled realm, and I tell them the truth, that the coward bride was never a coward, that she refused a crown to save a king's life, and guarded him for 5 years in a servant's cloak, and struck the poisoned cup from his hand with her own. And then I ask Seraphine Aldair, in front of the people who called her a coward, if she will finish what the bond began. His voice had gone very low. The bride was always you. It was only ever going to be you. I just needed the world to watch me choose you, so that no one, not ever again, could make you into a story that isn't true. I could not answer him. I crossed the little room instead, and I put my head against his chest, over the roar of the bond, and he wrapped his arms around me, and for a long time, we simply stood there, 2 people who had been robbed of 5 years, holding on. The bans were read within the week. The king would marry, It was announced from the cathedral steps, the very steps where my name had once been read out, and then made a byword for cowardice. The king would take a bride at the turning of the season, her name to be revealed at the ceremony, and the whole kingdom went mad with it, as I had known it would. A king's wedding, the first Vore wedding in a generation. And I, in my grey cloak, carried the laundry through a palace turned upside down with preparation, and watched the Lord Chancellor Ambrose Deverane move through it all with his kind grey smile, congratulating the household, overseeing the arrangements, offering in his gentle, indispensable way to see to the wedding wine himself. And I watched Ridian accept the offer with a grateful clasp of the hand, and I understood that the trap had closed, and that neither man had said a single true word, and that one of them would not survive the wedding. It should have terrified me more than it did. Perhaps 5 years of fear had used mine up. Or perhaps it was that, for the first time in 5 years, I was not alone in it. Every night, I climbed the grandfather's stair, and we made our preparations. Which of his guard could be trusted absolutely? Few. Ambrose had fingers everywhere. Where I would stand, what the signal would be, how we would take Alric quietly the night before, so that the hand could not warn the head. And every night, when the work was done, we stood close in the small high room, and did not finish the bond, and it grew harder and sweeter, and I began to understand that the waiting itself had become a kind of vow between us, that we would come to it clean, in the open, chosen, or not at all. The night before the wedding, we took Ulrich. Ridian did it himself, quietly, with 2 men he trusted, in the grey hour before dawn, not as a king seizing a traitor, but as a man come to offer a frightened servant a way out. And it worked, because Ridian had understood the grip that held Alric better than Ambrose ever had, fear for his daughter, his grandchildren. Ridian did not threaten. He promised, he swore, on the crown, that whatever Alric had done, his daughter and her children would be taken under the king's own protection and want for nothing, if only Alric would tell the truth of who had made him pour the cup. And Alric, who had carried the poison in his heart for 11 days and hated himself for it, wept and told everything. Deverane, the threats against his family, the monkshood, the instruction, 5 years standing, to watch for the return of any woman who might be the king's true mate, and above all, to watch for the coward bride. And, at the last, shaking, the thing that turned it from a trap into a certainty, that Deverane had given him a second vial, for the wedding wine, and that he was to pour it into the king's cup at the moment of the toast. We had him, out of the hand's own mouth, before witnesses. We had the shape of the whole thing, but a hand's confession, extracted in a cellar, was still not the smiling face condemning itself in the open. We needed Ambrose himself. So Alric, who wanted nothing now but to save his soul and his grandchildren, agreed to play his part one last time, to pour the wine at the wedding exactly as Deverane had bidden him, but from a cup we had prepared, harmless, water and wine, and a little bitter herb for the smell, so that Deverane, watching, would believe the poison was in the king's hand, and reach, at last, openly, for the thing he thought he had won. The wedding dawned gold and cold and clear. I will not pretend I was not afraid. I stood in a chamber off the great hall, in a gown that was not grey, the first thing that was not grey I had worn in 5 years, an ivory gown laced close, my dark-dyed hair grown out enough now to show the true colour at the roots, a woman coming up out of 5 years of shadow, and my hands shook, and the ache under my breastbone had become something else entirely, a great trembling readiness, the bond straining toward the hour it had waited 5 years for. Down the hall, the whole realm was gathering, every great house, princes and heiresses, and the daughters of a dozen powerful families, the same court that had gasped when the bond turned to me, and then sung that I was a coward when I fled. And somewhere among them, gentle and grey and smiling, the Lord Chancellor Ambrose Deverane, waiting for a bride to be named, so that he could kill a king before the vows were done. The plan was simple, which is the only kind of plan that survives contact with the moment. Ridian would take his place. The court would assemble, the wedding wine would be brought, and Alric would pour, and the toast would be called, and Ridian would lift the cup, and let Ambrose see him lift it, let him watch the king raise the poison to his lips, and then, at the last instant, he would set it down untasted, and call the Chancellor's name. And Ambrose, seeing the plot fail in the king's steady hand, seeing the king alive, and the cup lowered, and his own name in the king's mouth, would understand that he was known, and a man who understands he is known does not stay gentle. We were gambling everything on that, on Ambrose Deverain, cornered, showing the court his teeth. It very nearly went wrong. I was to come in at the naming of the bride. That was my part, to walk the length of the great hall to the throne as the coward bride returned, so that the whole court, and above all Ambrose, would see, at the worst possible moment for him, that the king's mate had come back, and the bond was about to be completed, and his last hope was ending before his eyes. I stood behind the great doors and I listened. I heard the hall fall silent. I heard Ridian's voice, carrying, calling the realm to witness. I heard the wine brought, and I knew Alric was pouring, and I pressed my hand to the door and breathed, anchor, floor, breath, next thing, the way my father's old master-at-arms had taught me, a lifetime ago. And then I heard the toast called, and I heard, in the silence after, nothing at all, which meant Ridian had lifted the cup, and I could not see. I could only stand behind the door, with my heart in my throat, and trust him, and trust the plan, and trust the frightened, brave old man with the wine. And then I heard Ridian's voice ring out, Ambrose, and I did not wait for my cue. I pushed the doors open, and I walked into the great hall of Valmonte for the first time in 5 years. I will remember it all my life, the long, bright length of the hall, the hundreds of faces turning, the gasp, the same gasp, the very same gasp that had gone through the cathedral 5 years before, when the bond turned to me, running through the court like wind through grass, as one great house after another recognized the coward bride walking, unafraid, toward the king. And at the head of the hall, Ridian, standing before the throne with the untasted cup still in his hand, alive, whole, his eyes finding me across the sea of them, exactly as they had 5 years ago, and the bond flaring between us so bright it seemed the whole hall must see it burning in the air. And beside him, 3 steps away, the Lord Chancellor Ambrose Deverain, his kind grey face gone the colour of ash, staring at me, staring at the living king, staring at the cup that had not killed, and understanding, in one terrible instant, that he was known, that it had all been a trap, that everything was ending. I saw the moment he broke. I saw the gentleness go out of his face like a candle pinched, and I saw, we all saw, the whole realm saw, the Lord Chancellor of Valmonte snatch a blade from beneath his robe and lunge for the king. He was old, and it was fear that moved him, not skill, and Ridian had been waiting 5 years for it. The king turned the blade aside with the very cup in his hand. The wine flew, harmless water and herb, spraying across the marble. And then Ridian's guards, the few he trusted absolutely, had Deverain by both arms, and it was over, in the space of a breath, in front of every great house of the realm. Over. 5 years, and it ended in the space of a breath, with an old man held struggling before the throne, and a hall full of the most powerful people in the kingdom, staring in horror at the murderer they had all trusted. "Say it," Ridian said. His voice filled the hall. He did not shout. He did not have to. "You've drawn steel on your king before the whole realm, Ambrose. There's no smiling out of that. So tell them the rest. Tell them why. Tell them about the cup 11 days ago, and the cup 5 years planned, and tell them why a chancellor would murder the king he swore to serve." He stepped closer to the struggling old man. "Tell them, or I'll let her." And he looked at me. And Ambrose Deverain, cornered, unmasked, with 30 years of careful, indispensable loyalty, turned to ash, in a single breath, and his life already forfeit, did what such men do when the mask is finally torn away. He stopped pretending. The hatred that had hidden behind the grey smile for 6 years came up into his face at last, naked and ugly, and almost a relief to him, I think, after so long. "Because you were never fit for it," he spat. A boy of 19, who took back a kingdom I ran better than your father ever did, and smiled at me, and thought I'd be grateful for the keys. I held this realm together, and then you came of age, and I handed it all back to a pup, and I have watched you play at kingship for 6 years, and the only mercy in it, the only mercy, was that you had no mate, and no heir, and one bad winter might have handed it back to me." His eyes went to me, and the hatred in them was terrible. And then she came. The once-in-90 years miracle. And I knew if the bond ever completed, I'd never rule again, so I made ready to kill you the moment it did. And then the little fool refused you and ran, and did my work for me, and I thought it done. 5 quiet years. And now you'd get an heir even without her. You'd end me even now. So yes, I put the monk's hood in your cup, and I'd do it again. And my only regret is that clumsy hands spilled it. He was shaking, spent, the truth pouring out of him unstoppable now. You were never the king. I was. You just wore the crown. The hall was utterly silent. And then it was not silent, because 100 of the greatest lords in the realm had just heard the beloved Chancellor confess, out of his own mouth, in the open, that he had poisoned the king. And the silence broke into an uproar that Ridian let run for exactly as long as it took, for every house to understand what it had witnessed. Then he raised his hand, and the hall stilled. "You held the regency for 8 months," Ridian said quietly, "and you never forgave the realm for ending it. You've said enough, Ambrose. You've said it in front of every house whose loyalty you spent 30 years buying. They've heard you." He turned from the old man as one turns from something already dead, and gave the quiet order that ended it, and the guards took Ambrose Deverain out of the great hall, and out of our story, and I will not spend more words on him than that, because he spent 5 years of ours, and I will not give him more. And then the hall was quiet again, and Ridian Vor turned, in front of the whole assembled realm, to me. He came down from the throne. He crossed the length of the hall, past the great houses, past the princesses and the heiresses, exactly as the bond had crossed them 5 years before. And he stopped in front of me, and he took both my calloused hands in his, and he spoke so that the whole realm could hear. "You've all heard a story these 5 years," he said. "Not to me, to them," though he did not look away from my face. "The coward bride, the girl who was offered a crown and a king, and fled into the night. You sang it. I let you. I even believed it, in the worst of my nights, because it hurt less than the truth." His hands tightened on mine. "Here is the truth. This is Seraphine Aldair. 5 years ago the bond turned to her in the cathedral, and 3 days later she stood in my throne room and refused it. Not because she was afraid of me, but because she had been warned that if she completed the bond, I would be murdered by the man you all just heard confess. She refused a crown to keep me alive, and then, because the bond would not let her go far, she cut her hair and took a servant's name and came back into this palace. And for 5 years, she has carried my washing and laid my fires and watched over me in a grey cloak, while you sang that she was a coward. 11 days ago, she struck a poisoned cup from my hand and saved my life a second time. Everything you were ever told about this woman was wrong. She is the bravest soul in this kingdom, and I have loved her for 5 years, and I let her walk away once because I was a fool, and I will not do it twice." He knelt, an alpha king, before the whole realm, knelt on the marble of his own great hall, and looked up at a laundrywoman in an ivory gown, and said, "Seraphine Aldair, 5 years ago you said no to save my life. There's no shadow left now, no prophecy, no smiling man, nothing to save me from. So I'm asking you the question again, and this time, there's no reason in the world to lie to me. Will you finish what the bond began? Will you have me?" And I looked down at the one soul in all the world that answered mine, kneeling before his whole court with his heart open in his face. And after 5 years of grey cloaks and false names, and the great lie of my life, I told him the truest thing I have ever said. Yes, I said. Gods, yes, yes. The bond completed as he rose. I had feared it, a little, the old prophecy, the completed bond that was meant to be a blade, but my nurse had seen true in all things, and true in this. It was only ever the smiling man who made the bond a death. With him gone, the bond was only what it had always been meant to be. It finished as Rydian came to his feet and drew me against him, and the 5-year ache under my breastbone flared one last time, and then, at last, went quiet. Not gone, never gone, but quiet, filled, whole. The second heart that had begun to beat in the cathedral 5 years ago, finally beating in time with his. I felt him in it. I felt him, the way the old ones say you do, his joy and his grief and his disbelief and his love, all pouring through the bond, into me and mine, pouring back into him. And we stood in the great hall of Valmonte, with the whole realm watching and wept, both of us, for the 5 years we had lost, and the life we had, at the last, refused to let be stolen. We were wed that same day. There seemed no reason to wait. We had waited 5 years, and a bond already completed asks for its vows sooner rather than later. I remember very little of the ceremony itself, if I am honest. It passed like something underwater. The cathedral, the crowd, the words. What I remember is the walk to it. I remember that the housekeeper who had scolded me for breaking a cup, the sharp-tongued woman who had ruled the laundry with an iron hand and never once suspected who folded her linens, was there in the crowd, and that when I passed her in my ivory gown, she went white as a sheet, and then, slowly, put her worn red hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled, not with fear of having scolded a queen, but with something else, something like pride, the fierce, startled pride of a hard woman who has just learned that one of her own girls, one of the invisible ones, was a queen all along, and never lauded it, never once. I stopped. In front of the whole procession, I stopped, and I took that rough hand in both of mine, and I said, "Thank you. You gave me work when I had nowhere, and you never asked my name, and you were kinder than you ever knew." And she could not speak, and I went on, and I saw her weeping into her apron as I passed. And of all the faces in that whole gilded day, hers is the one I remember clearest, because she had known me when I was no one, and been decent to me when there was nothing to gain by it, and that is a rarer thing in a palace than any crown. And I remember, at the very last, standing at the cathedral door as we came out wed, the same cathedral, the very steps where my name had been read out 5 years before and made a byword for cowardice, and looking out over the city and thinking that the girl of 19 in the borrowed gown who had felt the bond turn to her in this very building could never in 1,000 years have imagined the road between that day and this one. 5 years in grey, and now this. Rydian's hand in mine, warm and certain, and the bond singing quiet and whole between us, and a whole life ahead that we had fought the world to keep. I wore the ivory gown. Ulrich's daughter and grandchildren came, under the king's protection as he had sworn, and the old man himself was pardoned for the truth he had told, and wept through the whole ceremony. The great houses that had sung the ballad of the coward bride stood witness now to its unmaking, and I did not gloat in it, because I had never done any of it for them. I had done it for the man beside me, and having him was all the vindication I would ever need. There were things to mend after, that no ballad ever mentions, because the mending of a life is slow and quiet, and makes poor singing. There was my father, first. House Aldair had been old and dwindling when I fled, and my disappearance had finished it. A coward daughter is a stain no dwindling house recovers from, and the shame of the ballad had broken what little the family had left. My father had died in the 3rd year of my exile, I learned, believing his daughter a coward, who had shamed them past redeeming, and that grief is one the bond cannot mend, and the crown cannot buy back. I will carry it always. But there were others. A younger cousin, Thomasine, who had kept the last Aldair holding by his fingernails through 5 years of the family's disgrace, and who wept when I came to him at last in my own name and told him the truth, that the shame had been a lie, that I had refused the crown to save the king, that House Aldair had not bred a coward but a queen. Ridian restored the house himself, by royal decree, before the whole court, and named the true reason for its long disgrace, and unmade it, so that the name Aldair meant something again, and Thomasine sat at the high table at feasts, where once no Aldair would have been let past the door. I did that. Not the crown, the truth did it. But I was glad, past telling, to give my father's name back its honour, even if I could not give it to my father. And there was the matter of my nurse. I had thought of her every day for 5 years, the old woman with the sight who had come to me in the dark and set my whole life on its strange course, whom I had left behind when I fled, never knowing what became of her. I feared the worst. The old and the sighted do not fare well when the households they served are broken. But Ridian sent riders quietly to find her, because he understood without my asking that I could not be wholly at peace until I knew. And they found her, alive, ancient now and nearly blind, living with a family of herb-gatherers in the eastern hills, who had taken her in for her wisdom and never known she had once whispered a prophecy that saved a king. They brought her to the palace. I went to her myself, in my own name, in a gown that was not grey, and she took my hands in her old blind ones, and felt them, and knew me at once, the way she had always known me. And she wept, and I wept, and she said, "I saw the thread of it, child, but I never saw the end. I saw the death that waited. I never saw that you would turn it aside and live to be happy. I did not know that was in the weave." And I told her it had been, that everything she had seen was true, the faceless man, the poison, the smiling one who waited, all of it true, but that she had been wrong about one thing, the only thing, which was that it could not be beaten. It could. We had beaten it. And she held my hands and laughed through her tears, an old woman who had carried a terrible sight for a lifetime and lived, at the last, to learn that a sight of death need not be a sentence. She lived out her years in comfort in the palace, honoured, and she was there, old and blind and glad, when our first child was born, and she held him, and she said she could feel no shadow on him at all, none, only a long bright thread, and I have chosen to believe her, because she saw true in all things but one, and I would rather trust the sight that saved us than fear it. And there was the bond itself, in the days and weeks after, the finished bond that I had feared for 5 years, and that turned out to be the great quiet joy of my life. It is not what the ballads make of it, the completed mate bond. It is not all fire and rapture, though there is that. It is mostly this, the knowing. I feel him now, always, a warm, steady presence at the edge of my own heart. His moods are whether I live inside, his joy adding to mine, and his griefs halved by my sharing them. On the black nights that still come to a king, and they come, ruling is a weight no crown makes lighter, I wake before he does, because I feel the darkness gathering in him through the bond, and I am awake to meet it when he surfaces, so that he is never again alone in it, the way he was for 5 years. That is the thing I was made for, not the crown, which I never wanted and wear only because it comes with him. This, to be the one soul that knows him, awake at his side in the dark, so that the most known and loneliest man in the kingdom is never lonely again. I refused a crown for 5 years to keep him alive. I would refuse 100 more, and carry 100 years of washing, for the right to be the one who meets him in the dark. They make a new ballad now, in the servants' hall, and the great houses both. I hear it sometimes, drifting up from the kitchens or down from the gallery, and it has most of the facts right, which is more than the old one ever did. It tells of the bride who refused a crown to save her king, and hid 5 years in a servant's cloak to guard him, and struck the poison from his hand, and named the traitor, and was made queen at last in the very hall where she was called a coward. It is a good ballad. It makes me sound braver and cleverer than I was. That is what ballads do. But there is one thing it leaves out. One thing the minstrels never think to sing, and it is the truest part of the whole story. So I will set it down here at the end, where I promise to tell it true. The truest part is not the refusal, or the disguise, or the poison, or the traitor's fall. The truest part is the small high room in the old tower, and the 11 nights we stood a hand's breadth apart and did not finish the bond, because we had both decided, without ever saying it, that we would come to each other clean and chosen, and in the open, or not at all. That is the part I hold to, not the crown, not the vindication. Those 11 nights of choosing him, over and over, in the dark, with the bond roaring and the war unfinished, and every reason to fall, and neither of us falling. Because after 5 years of loving him in secret, of guarding him from the shadows, of being no one so that he could live, I wanted, more than I have ever wanted anything, to love him at last as myself. In my own name, with my head up, chosen and choosing. I think, sometimes, about the woman I might have been if the bond had never turned to me at all. The forgettable girl of a dwindling house, married off to some minor lord, living a small, quiet life, and never knowing she had a king's soul waiting in her. She would have been safer. She would have been happier, perhaps, in the ordinary way that people are happy when nothing is ever asked of them. But she would never have known this, the particular, hard-won, 5 years bought joy of loving someone so much that you would let the whole world call you a coward to keep him breathing, and then live to be called his queen. I would not trade it. Not the grey years, not the ache, not the fear, not one day of it, because every day of it led here, and here is where I was always meant to be. I am Seraphine Aldair now, Queen of Valmonte, mate of the Alpha King, and I have not worn grey in a very long time. But I keep the old cloak folded in a chest at the foot of our bed, and now and then, on the hard anniversaries, I take it out and hold it, and Rydian finds me there, and sits with me, and we are quiet together, over the thing that nearly cost us everything. 5 years I was invisible in this palace. 5 years I carried the king's washing, and never let him see my face. The girls still lay the fires before the lord's wake. The women still carry the linens down the servants' stair. The palace still runs, as every palace does, on 100 hands that no one is meant to notice. And I notice them now. Every one, because I was one of them, and I make certain they are seen. That is the other thing the ballad leaves out, and perhaps the one I am proudest of, that the Queen of Valmonte knows the name of every laundrywoman in her house, and speaks it, and that no girl beats a carpet in this palace unremarked while I live. I was invisible once. I will not let this house forget that its invisible ones are people, with names, and grief, and worth. It costs me nothing. It would have meant the whole world to me, once, in a grey cloak. He sees it now. He sees it every morning, first thing, before anything else in the world, and every morning, for the rest of my life. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything I refused a crown to keep, and kept, and have at last, in the open, in my own name, forever.